A Navy SEAL and his loyal German shepherd found a hidden bunker buried under the desert, sealed for 70 years. Inside, something was still alive. But the moment the metal chamber shook, he realized the bunker wasn't sleeping. Something deep below had just awakened. What he uncovered next would test his courage, his faith, and the miracle that carried him through the darkness. And as sunlight touched the survivors, he learned one truth: miracles often hide where no one looks. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The desert lay wide and quiet under a dim morning haze, its silence stretched thin like an old sheet of parchment ready to tear. Ethan Cooper stepped out of the military transport truck and let the dry wind sweep across his face. It carried a faint, metallic tang, unusual for this part of New Mexico, and the instant it touched his senses, something inside him tightened. He had learned long ago to trust small disturbances. They had saved his life more times than luck ever had. Ranger, the German shepherd, who had been his partner since a rescue mission 2 years earlier, followed close at his heel. The dog paused, ears tilting forward, nose lifted, as if sniffing an old memory rising from the sand. Ethan felt the way Ranger's body tensed, not in fear, but in recognition. Ranger had survived being buried under collapsed debris once, trapped for hours until Ethan clawed through broken concrete to pull him out. Ever since, the dog reacted to shifts in ground pressure and strange scents beneath soil with almost supernatural intuition. It wasn't instinct anymore. It was history carved into nerve and bone. Ethan surveyed the landscape. Satellite imagery had shown a large depression and unstable ground. Headquarters suspected illegal tunnelers or abandoned Cold War infrastructure exposed by last week's storm. It should have been a simple reconnaissance. Check the anomaly, report back, wait for engineers. But Ethan rarely believed in simple missions. They usually hid something complicated behind them, something the briefing papers didn't cover. He tightened the straps of his pack, feeling the heat already rising from the sand, though the sun hadn't fully climbed. His mind, usually calm before missions, wandered uncomfortably today. A flicker of unease told him he was stepping toward something forgotten, something that should have stayed buried. He brushed the thought aside. He had learned to manage fear not by ignoring it, but by folding it neatly into purpose. "Ranger," he murmured, voice low, "let's take a look." The dog moved ahead, steady and sure. Ethan followed, boots sinking into loose sediment softened by the storm. Their tracks trailed behind them like temporary signatures destined to vanish at the next gust of wind. As they approached the coordinates, the ground shifted subtly beneath his feet. A soft crunch, not like gravel but like the thin shell over a hollow space. He crouched, brushing the sand away with gloved fingers. Under the loose layer lay a slab of old steel, weathered yet unmistakably manufactured. Ethan's breathing slowed. That metallic tang made sense now. He circled the slab. Its surface bore no markings he could see, but the way the sand sagged inward meant there was more underneath. Ranger paced along the edge, nose pressed near cracks where faint drafts of colder air leaked upward. The dog's tail stiffened, body leaning toward the seam as if drawn by memory. Ethan felt a knot coiled deep in his chest. Something about this stillness, this buried structure, tugged at the part of his mind that had learned the difference between danger and revelation. A low rumble vibrated through the ground. Ethan froze. The vibration grew, soft at first, but rising like a throat clearing beneath the earth. Ranger barked, not in alarm, but in warning. Ethan took a step back, just as the slab groaned, metal straining, sand cascading downward in lazy waves. The storm had weakened the support structure. The earth was preparing to give way. "Back!" Ethan shouted, but the command arrived too late. The ground collapsed beneath them. For a heartbeat, Ethan felt the world tilt sideways. His feet left the surface. Sand erupted around him, and he fell through a cloud of dust that pulled him into darkness. Ranger's body brushed against his leg mid-air, a warm flash of movement before gravity swallowed them both. Ethan hit something hard. Steel, cold and unforgiving. Air punched out of his lungs. Ranger landed beside him with a low grunt. Everything went still. He lay motionless, letting the pain map itself across his ribs and spine. When oxygen returned in short, sharp breaths, he pushed himself upright. A thin ray of daylight angled down through the hole above, illuminating the space around them. They were in a corridor, a man-made one. Walls of reinforced metal stretched into shadow on both sides, dust coating every inch. It wasn't a criminal tunnel. It was a facility, old, secret, and untouched by human presence for decades. Ranger took a step forward, then another, head low and movements deliberate. Ethan could feel the dog's inner tension, a mix of curiosity and unease. Ranger didn't fear enclosed spaces anymore, but he remembered them. He remembered the weight of rubble above him, the muffled world, the waiting. That memory lived inside him like a quiet flame, guiding him now as he tested the corridor's air. Ethan rose to his feet and followed slowly, his pulse leveling out as training took over. He studied the corridor, rust patterns, air temperature, density of dust, the decayed smell of old machinery. Everything pointed to abandonment, not sabotage, yet something about it felt preserved, as if time hadn't fully touched this place. He swept his flashlight across the walls. Stenciled letters, nearly erased, revealed fragments of words. Command, sector, and what looked like 93, half buried beneath corrosion. Ethan's stomach tightened. That year echoed faintly in his memory. He'd read an old case file once, a small footnote about a missing Marine recon unit lost in the deserts during a classified exercise. No bodies, no wreckage, nothing ever recovered until now. He forced his mind to focus. Speculation wouldn't help him survive this environment. He needed to find a way out, assess structural stability, call for support. Yet part of him sensed that he had stumbled upon something far bigger than an old bunker, something that the wind and sand had kept hidden for reasons he didn't yet understand. Ranger stopped. His body stiffened again, but this time it wasn't at the ground. It was at the air. A faint current drifted down the corridor, carrying a smell only the dog seemed to recognize, a smell that made his ears tilt downward in confusion and concern. Ethan inhaled, but detected nothing distinct. Still, he trusted Ranger more than any instrument. He placed a hand gently on the dog's back, grounding himself. "Easy," he whispered. They moved deeper into the corridor. Each step felt like walking across the threshold of a story that had begun long before he was born. Ethan felt his heartbeat settle, not from calm, but from determination. He didn't know what lay ahead, but something inside him, shaped by loss, duty, and the years he spent learning to carry the weight of other men's mistakes, told him he had to keep going. Whatever this place was, it wasn't finished with its purpose. And now, neither was he. The chapter ends, As Ethan and Ranger step farther into the darkness, unaware that this corridor will lead them to 12 forgotten lives waiting to wake, and to a truth buried deeper than the sand above them. The corridor stretched into a muted twilight, the air still and cold as if sealed away from the world for generations. Ethan moved slowly, letting Ranger take the lead, the dog's silence more telling than any written warning. The faint echo of their footsteps blended with the distant hum of metal resting under decades of dust. Ethan felt a shift in the air long before he understood what it meant. A subtle draft brushed against his cheek, too cold to belong to desert stone. It carried a sterile scent, the kind found in old infirmaries or sealed laboratories where time had been forced to stand still. He raised his flashlight, sweeping it across the passage. On the wall hung a faded sign, its lettering half erased, but still readable. Medical Wing, restricted personnel only. Ranger halted. His chest rose and fell with quiet, rhythmic tension. Ethan recognized the behavior. It was the same way Ranger had acted during a collapsed building rescue years ago, when faint signs of life had seeped through ash and concrete. Ranger wasn't afraid. He was listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's back, grounding himself. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, though his own heart drummed in an uneasy rhythm. He advanced toward the medical wing door. The hinges resisted at first, then gave way with a dry metallic groan as he forced it open. The room beyond was dim, bathed in a dull amber glow coming from an emergency bulb that flickered irregularly as if struggling against the weight of decades. Ethan stepped inside. Then he stopped breathing. 12 steel beds lined the far wall in 2 rows, each bed fitted with an armature of tubes, valves, and faded monitoring tags. What stunned him was not the equipment, but the bodies lying upon them. 12 men, older now, significantly older than the young Marines they must have once been, but not as old as they should have been. Their faces bore the marks of time, loose skin, silvered hair, deep-set fatigue, yet their bodies remained thin and frail, not collapsed by the weight of full aging. More than anything, they looked preserved in suffering, as if their years had passed in the slow cadence of hunger and stillness. Ethan's breath hitched. He moved to the nearest bed and placed 2 fingers against the man's neck. There, a pulse, weak, staggered, but undeniable. Ranger let out a low whine, not in fear, but in recognition of life. Ethan examined the IV system attached to the man. It was primitive but functional, gravity-fed from a series of sealed canisters, with an auto-switch valve built on simple mechanical pressure, old Cold War engineering, designed to keep patients alive without electricity. It must have activated itself during the collapse or years earlier, switching bags every time weight and pressure dropped. Ethan traced the tubes with his eyes, noting that many cans were empty. Some hadn't been changed in years, yet somehow the system had kept these men suspended between life and death. He began checking the others, 11 pulses, all faint, all slow but present. A whole team, a forgotten unit, a group buried by accident or oversight, not malice. Ethan felt the weight of the discovery settle on his shoulders. What had happened here? Why had these men been left? Ranger nudged a particular bed, the last one in the row. When Ethan looked down, he saw a man who seemed younger than the others, or at least less ravaged by the years. The lines on his face were softer, his features still holding some memory of youth beneath the exhaustion. Ranger lowered his head, exhaling shakily as if the man's presence stirred something deep in him. Ethan placed a hand on the man's wrist. The pulse was thready, dangerously shallow. Something compelled Ethan to speak, though he knew the man couldn't hear him. "You're not done yet," he murmured, feeling the grim resolve that often rose in him before impossible rescues. He stood and scanned the room, noticing the faint hum of a ventilation system still functioning. Cold War bunkers had been built to survive disasters without modern power grids. The ventilation was likely mechanically powered, just enough to preserve the facility's internal environment. Ethan approached the control panel beside the far wall. Dust coated the switches, but one lever remained partially raised. Auxiliary air, manual override. He hesitated, unsure whether resetting anything would risk destabilizing whatever fragile balance kept these men alive. Ranger growled softly, a wary warning sound. Ethan followed the dog's gaze toward a shadow near the corner. His flashlight revealed another door, heavy, reinforced, marked with a single phrase, "Containment, authorized personnel only." His pulse quickened, a familiar burn rising in his chest. He had felt this once before, during a mission overseas when an unmarked room concealed more wounded survivors than anyone had expected. He had forced that door open then. He might have to do the same now, but first he needed to stabilize what he had already found. He returned to the row of beds and inhaled deeply, trying to silence the rising anger at the thought of 12 men abandoned in silence for 70 years. There would be answers here, answers not everyone might want uncovered. Ranger moved close again, brushing against Ethan's leg. The dog's quiet presence steadied him. Ethan touched Ranger's collar gently, a silent promise between partners forged through hard years and harder missions. "We keep going," he whispered, "but we do this smart." He took one last sweeping look across the room. 12 fragile heartbeats echoing the weight of an unspoken history. His flashlight flickered. A soft, mechanical click sounded from somewhere deeper in the corridor behind them, unmistakably recent and not caused by him. Someone, or something, had triggered a mechanism elsewhere in the abandoned facility. Ethan turned toward the sound, every instinct sharpening at once. Ranger's ears snapped forward. The dog's body lowered into a stance that meant one thing only: something ahead was alive or moving. Ethan tightened his grip on his flashlight and stepped toward the doorway. The darkness beyond felt thicker than before, and somewhere inside it a new truth waited to be found. The stale air in the corridor shifted with a faint vibration so slight that it might have been nothing more than the settling of old metal, yet Ethan felt it like a tremor running beneath his skin. He stood still, listening. Ranger remained in a half-crouched stance beside him, ears angled toward the direction of the sound, body tense but steady. The dog's poise never came from fear. It came from memory, from the years he had learned that small noises often meant trapped survivors or hidden threats. Ethan raised his flashlight toward the dim hallway extending beyond the containment door. The beam cut through dust, revealing nothing at first, only the sterile quiet of a place abandoned by everyone except time. But then the faint click echoed again, as if some dormant system was shifting back to life. He forced his breathing to settle, reminding himself that panic distorted judgment. He moved closer to the source, feeling the cold touch of air leaking around the edges of the sealed door. The reinforced panel bore a rusted label, hardly legible, but unmistakably military in tone: Biohazard Isolation. He didn't know if the label had been precaution or truth, or simply bureaucracy gone rigid during the Cold War. Nevertheless, the presence of the 12 men behind him suggested that fear, not clarity, had shaped whatever had happened here decades ago. Ranger pressed forward, sniffing at the seam in the metal. His body leaned slightly away from it, betraying a subtle conflict in him. Ethan recognized it instantly. This was the same behavior Ranger displayed during missions when the presence of life mixed with the scent of illness or long confinement. It unsettled the dog in ways Ethan could never fully understand, but he trusted the signal more than any written warning. Ethan pressed his palm lightly against the cold steel of the door. It didn't move, not even a rattle. Whatever system had clicked awake was not the door itself, but something deeper inside the facility. He stepped back, returning to the medical room. The weak amber glow still flickered over the 12 sleeping forms. He studied them more carefully now. Their breathing patterns differed, some shallow, some ragged, all fragile. They weren't uniformly preserved. Each man had aged at a different rate, depending on metabolism and stress sustained during long-term unconsciousness. Ethan examined the monitoring tags attached to their beds. Most of the ink had faded, but a few names remained faint enough to read. One tag read, T. McKinley Zardagnet. Next to it another, Private Hale. Their ranks and last names were all that remained of their identities, but that alone grounded them in the real world. They were not lost myths. They had been real soldiers with real assignments. He moved to the youngest-looking man again, the one Ranger had gravitated toward. Ethan tilted the tag to catch the light. Corporal Samuel Dwyer. The name stirred nothing in Ethan, but Ranger's soft rumble made him look down. The dog rested his muzzle near the corporal's shoulder and exhaled as though letting out a long-held breath. Ethan sensed a strange connection forming, one forged not by history, but by the echo of shared vulnerability. Dwyer's pulse remained faint, almost thread-thin, barely tethering him to the world. Ethan had seen men in this state before. Some had returned, some had slipped away. The clicking sound came again. This time louder, clearer. Ethan whipped around, instinct tightening as the facility's lights flickered. A low hum rolled through the floor like a generator coughing awake after decades of dormancy. The ventilation shafts rattled softly, confirming that something had reactivated the auxiliary systems. He scanned the ceiling. No fumes, no changes in air pressure that might indicate contamination. Whatever system had restarted wasn't harmful immediately, but it was unpredictable, and unpredictability was the enemy of survival. Ethan moved toward the wall-mounted control panel again. This time, a small red indicator blinked where before all lights had been dead. The label beneath it read, Containment Sector, Power Restoration Sequence. He felt his throat tighten. Someone in 1953 had wired this facility to reactivate in stages if triggered. But why? To revive whoever was inside, to purge contamination, to secure classified elements. He didn't know which possibility posed the greatest risk. Ranger nudged Ethan's leg lightly with his nose, urging him toward the corridor. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong, but Ethan hesitated. The 12 men behind him needed stability more than exploration. Yet he knew that whatever lay beyond the door might determine whether they lived long enough to be evacuated. The facility hummed a little louder. Somewhere in the walls, old gears shifted like bones cracking awake. Ethan approached the door again, just as a faint mechanical hiss whispered through the air. The seal along the bottom edge of the door released a thin stream of colder air, a sign that internal pressure was adjusting. Ethan stepped back quickly, positioning his body to shield Ranger if needed. He waited. No explosion, no smoke, only the slow exhale of a system rediscovering motion after a lifetime of stillness. Then came another sound, something soft but unmistakably alive. A faint thump, like a knee or elbow brushing metal. Ethan froze. Ranger's ears snapped forward. The dog's body stiffened, not from alarm but from certainty. There was someone in the containment sector, someone mobile, someone who had not been lying in the medical beds. Ethan's pulse hammered. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the door. He whispered, "Stay close." And Ranger moved exactly as trained, aligning himself slightly ahead, prepared but silent. The containment door creaked, not fully opening, but shifting just enough to let a narrow sliver of darkness spill into the hall. Through that sliver, Ethan thought he heard breathing. Not mechanical, human, and not the labored breath of someone near death, but the controlled, uneven inhale of a person struggling to stay conscious. The facility wasn't just waking old machines, it was waking someone else. The chapter closes as Ethan steps toward the narrow opening, heart pounding, Ranger steady beside him, both bracing for whoever or whatever waits behind the cracked door. Cold, recycled air drifted through the narrow hallway as Ethan approached the cracked containment door, Ranger moving in silent coordination beside him. The hum of the reactivated systems pulsed through the walls with a steady, unnatural rhythm, turning the corridor into a spine of metal and shadows, guiding them towards the unknown. Ethan paused just before reaching the opening. The gap was wider now, not by much, but enough to signal that something on the other side was no longer inert. He steadied his breath and eased one hand forward, signaling Ranger to hold position. From beyond the door came the uneven breathing he had heard earlier, this time accompanied by the faint scrape of movement, like someone struggling to maintain balance. "If you can hear me," Ethan said quietly, "I'm not here to harm you." The reply came not as words, but a muffled shift of weight, the kind made by someone exhausted yet unwilling to collapse. Ethan slipped through the narrow opening with Ranger stepping in right behind him. The room on the other side was dimly lit, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of emergency strips running along the floor. The space resembled an auxiliary stabilization chamber, smaller than the medical bay, but lined with metal benches and equipment lockers that had long lost their purpose. In the far corner, half slumped against the wall, sat a man. His breathing was shallow but deliberate, as though forcing himself to remain upright through sheer will. Ethan raised his flashlight slightly. "Stay still," he said gently. "Let me see if you're injured." The man flinched at the light but didn't pull away. His face was pale, his eyes reddened with the strain of waking from an unnatural sleep. His uniform, similar to the others, hung loosely on his body, wrinkles stiff with age. Ethan knelt, keeping his movement slow. "What's your name?" The man swallowed, his voice emerging as a rough whisper. "Lieutenant Mark Hanley." Ranger stepped closer, sniffing lightly before settling in a calm stance. Ethan could tell the dog sensed no immediate threat. That alone eased the tension in his spine. "How long?" Hanley's voice cracked as he tried to speak. "How long have we been in here?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. The truth was heavy, and delivering it to a man barely clinging to consciousness felt like dropping a stone on brittle glass. Instead, He examined the lieutenant's pulse, weak but steady, and checked for signs of severe deterioration. Hanley winced slightly at the touch, his muscles fighting through stiffness built over years of forced stillness. "You weren't in the medical bay with the others," Ethan said. "Why were you here?" Hanley let out a weak breath that might have been a laugh or a tremor. "Stabilization room," he murmured. "My pod failed first. System moved me here. Emergency relocation." That explained the clicking earlier. It wasn't a person trying to escape. It was an automated protocol reassigning life support to a damaged pod. The facility had tried to save him. Ethan helped Hanley shift his weight, careful not to provoke further strain. Hanley's head rested back against the wall as he regained enough breath to speak again. "The others, are they alive?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, they're weak, but alive. You'll see them soon." Relief washed briefly across Hanley's expression before his gaze sharpened again. "There's more," he whispered. "You shouldn't be here. This place wasn't just a shelter. They tried things here, classified trials, quiet, off the record." His breathing quickened, and Ethan put a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy. Tell me what you can." Hanley closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. "We were part of a test unit. Not volunteers, not exactly. We thought we were helping develop rapid medical deployment systems. Cryostasis, chemical stabilization. But the brass—" His voice trailed off into a rasp. Ethan felt old frustration rise inside him, the kind shaped by years of discovering that missions rarely matched the truths behind them. Ranger let out a low sound and lifted his head, body stiffening. Ethan's hand froze mid-motion. The dog wasn't focused on Hanley anymore. He was staring toward the far end of the room, where a grated ventilation cover sat loosely in its frame. A faint, metallic clang echoed behind it. Ethan's stomach tightened. Something, or someone, was moving within the ducts. Hanley's eyes slowly opened, following Ethan's gaze. "There was another unit," he whispered, "not with us. A different group. They kept them in the lower sectors. I don't know what happened to them." Ethan rose slowly, training his flashlight on the vent. "Is there another access point to the lower levels?" "Mechanical lift beyond this room," Hanley said weakly. "Only activated manually. They shut it down when the containment protocol started." Ranger stepped forward, sniffing at the vent, tail low but steady. The movement inside the duct stopped abruptly, as though whatever was there realized it had been detected. Ethan crouched and whispered to Ranger, "Stay alert." He turned back to Hanley. "We need to move you. Can you stand?" Hanley nodded faintly. Ethan supported him as they made their way toward the door. The lieutenant's legs trembled with each step, but he stayed upright. The faint clicking in the duct resumed, faster this time, moving away into unseen corridors like a warning sliding through metal veins. Ethan tightened his jaw. Whatever was down there wasn't designed to greet anyone gently. As they approached the hallway, Ranger looked back once more at the dim chamber they were leaving behind, ears tilting sharply, signaling one clear truth. The facility was not empty, and they were not alone. Chapter 4 ends on that tension, with Ethan guiding Hanley back toward the medical bay, and Ranger stopping at the hallway's edge, waiting, listening to something neither man could yet see. A low haze of dust hung in the corridor as Ethan guided Lieutenant Hanley back toward the medical wing, Ranger maintaining a constant watch at their side. The reactivated systems hummed in uneven pulses behind the walls, as if the entire underground facility were slowly relearning how to breathe after decades of silence. Ethan monitored Hanley's breathing as they moved. Every few steps, the lieutenant braced a hand against the wall, and Ethan steadied him without comment. Hanley's stubbornness reminded Ethan of men he had served with overseas, soldiers who refused to collapse even when their bodies begged for rest. It was a trait shaped not by arrogance, but by too many years of shouldering responsibility. "You're doing fine," Ethan murmured, though the tightness in Hanley's jaw betrayed the pain he was pushing through. When they reached the medical bay, the weak amber light still flickered over the resting forms of the 11 surviving soldiers. The air felt heavier here, saturated with the fragile rhythm of slow breaths rising and falling across the room. Hanley paused at the doorway, staring at the men who had once served under his command. "I thought," his voice faltered, "I thought they'd all be gone." Ethan helped him sit on an empty chair, making sure his position wouldn't strain him further. Ranger approached the nearest bed, sniffing carefully at the sleeping corporal. Dwyer. The dog held still for a long moment, the same silent recognition flickering through him as earlier. Ethan knelt beside Hanley. "You said another unit was kept below," he said. "What kind of unit?" Hanley rubbed his forehead, searching through foggy memories. "A classified medical group, not combat, specialists, scientists. We weren't allowed contact." "Did you ever see them?" Ethan pressed. Hanley shook his head slowly. "Not clearly, but I remember the voices. They didn't sound like rookies. They sounded terrified." Ethan felt that same cold tightness coil in his chest, the instinctive reaction he had learned to trust. Ranger let out a soft rumble, turning toward the far wall where a vertical shaft extended down into the lower levels. It was covered by a grated metal door secured by thick manual locks. Ethan approached the grate and ran his fingers along the edges. The metal was cold, much colder than the surrounding air. Something from below was rising through the shaft, not strong enough to trigger alarms, but enough to leave the steel icy to the touch. He flicked on his flashlight and directed the beam through the grate. The shaft plunged downward into darkness, deeper than the rest of the facility suggested. Then he saw it, a faint orange glow far below, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Not machinery, not fire, more like a warning light. But warning about what? Behind him, Hanley shifted. "We weren't told what they were working on," he said softly. "But before everything went black, I heard an argument from down there. Someone shouting about containment limits." Ethan turned. "Containment of what?" Hanley shook his head. "I don't know. We were only meant to test suspension protocols. They used us as the control group." Ranger's sudden growl snapped both men's attention toward the opposite corner of the bay. One of the resting soldiers twitched. Dwyer. The corporal's breathing, a moment ago steady, hitched sharply. His fingers curled around the edge of the thin blanket as though preparing to grip something. Ethan moved to his side. "Dwyer?" The man didn't open his eyes. He murmured something, his brow tightening. Ethan leaned closer. The words came out faint, but clear enough to stir a chill down his spine. "It's coming up! They're coming up!" Ethan's pulse hammered. Ranger backed away several steps, positioning himself between Ethan and the dark shaft. Hanley struggled to stand, using the chair for leverage. "This isn't right," he rasped. "He shouldn't be conscious. Not this soon." Ethan lifted his flashlight again, pointing it toward the shaft. The orange glow flickered faster now. A metallic clang echoed upward, distant but unmistakably deliberate, not the settling of old steel, not the shifting of machinery, a pattern, a sequence. Someone was activating something below. Ethan stepped toward the grated door, and Ranger blocked him, placing his body directly in front of Ethan's legs, not to resist him, but to warn him. The dog's eyes fixed unblinking on the darkness beneath the grate, every muscle rigid in that unwavering posture that only surfaced when danger was not hypothetical, but immediate. A second clang followed, then a third. Even Hanley backed away now. He stared at Ethan with fear that had nothing to do with age or weakness. "We never saw them," he whispered. "We never knew what they became down there." Ethan's breath deepened as he processed the truth edging into focus. The containment floor hadn't stayed dormant all these years. It hadn't simply preserved life. It had changed something. And now, whatever it held was waking up. Ranger let out a sharp bark, the sound echoing off the walls with cutting clarity. The orange light below suddenly went dark. For a full second, there was silence. Then the shaft exhaled a slow breath of cold air, rising upward like the first inhale of something long asleep. Chapter 5 closes as Ethan grips the grate, staring into the blackened shaft, Ranger bracing for whatever is now ascending, and Hanley whispering the chilling words he had held back for decades. We weren't the only ones they kept alive. A cold current drifted upward from the dark shaft, carrying with it the metallic scent of stale air long trapped below. Ethan tightened his grip on the grate, Ranger planted firmly beside him with a steady, low growl vibrating through his chest. The faint echoes that had risen moments before faded into silence, leaving only the tension of a place bracing for something long delayed. Ethan sensed the truth before he confirmed it. Whatever had stirred in the lower levels was no accident of machinery. Someone, or something, was awake. He stood and returned to Hanley, who had slumped back into the chair, exhausted yet alert, with the sharpness of a man haunted by knowledge he never dared speak. "Lieutenant," Ethan said quietly, "I need everything you remember about the lower unit. Anything at all." Hanley swallowed hard, gathering fragments of memory that had lain dormant for decades. "They weren't soldiers," he murmured. "They were civilian specialists, medical researchers, a few from engineering, volunteers, or so they thought. We heard rumors that they were conducting long-term isolation trials, psychological endurance testing, stress studies. But something changed. They started fighting the protocols, arguing with whoever was giving orders above." Ethan studied him closely. "Do you know why the facility sealed itself?" Hanley shook his head. "All I know is one night the alarms went off, not loud, just a low tone, like a warning meant only for the staff. Our oxygen levels dipped. I think they rerouted power to the lower floors trying to contain whatever was happening there." Ranger turned toward the shaft again, tail locked stiff, posture sharp, with instinctive caution. Ethan crouched beside him and whispered, "What do you hear?" The dog's eyes fixed on the grate with unwavering intensity. Ranger had survived collapsed buildings, battlefield chaos, and nights in the desert when Ethan himself doubted they'd see dawn. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. Ethan rose and moved toward the emergency console near the shaft. The system flickered with intermittent power, but enough function remained for the manual override to respond. A small screen displayed a schematic of the facility. Sector C, lower containment, blinked in red. Ethan exhaled slowly. It was active, not dead, not gone. Active. He pressed the diagnostic command. The reply came in fragmented text. Survival pods, 5. Status, compromised. Vital signs, irregular. Hanley leaned forward, gripping the edge of his chair. There were 5 specialists, he whispered. They kept them separate from us. If they're alive... Ethan didn't finish the sentence. If they're alive, they'd endured 70 years of unstable isolation in a sector designed to break them psychologically before anything else. As Ethan moved toward the manual lock, Ranger suddenly barked. Sharp, urgent, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Ethan snapped around. One of the soldiers in the beds, the oldest-looking sergeant, had jolted awake, eyes wide and unfocused. His arms trembled as he reached upward. Ethan moved to him instantly, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy," Ethan said. "You're safe. We're getting you out." The sergeant's lips parted, his voice scraped out in a weak whisper. "Don't open it." Ethan froze. "What did you say?" The sergeant swallowed, eyes flickering toward the shaft. "Don't open that door. They weren't stable. They changed." His breathing hitched and steadied only when Ranger approached, pressing gently against the side of the bed, a gesture Ethan had seen the dog make with trauma victims. It grounded them more effectively than any medicine. The sergeant inhaled, words gaining clarity. They locked themselves in, not to keep us out, but to keep something in. Ethan felt a cold weight settle behind his ribs. The puzzle pieces he had been piecing together took a darker shape. The lower unit had not been simply isolated. They had been isolating themselves from whatever went wrong in their experiments. Ethan turned back toward the grate, decisions crystallizing. "Lieutenant, how do we evacuate the facility manually, without activating lower-level access?" Hanley blinked at him, struggling through confusion. "You want to leave without checking what's down there?" Ethan nodded once. "If the specialists are alive but unstable, opening that sector might trigger systems we can't control, and getting you all out alive is the priority." Hanley nodded weakly. "Emergency ladder shafts, west corridor. They were built as fail-safes." Ethan helped the sergeant settle back onto the bed, then checked the others. Their vitals were weak but stable. They needed daylight and medical teams, not another hour entombed underground. Ethan shouldered his gear and signaled Ranger. The dog moved instantly, positioning himself between Ethan and the shaft as if affirming the decision. Hanley rose shakily with Ethan's support. The 3 headed toward the west corridor, where a rusted door marked auxiliary egress blocked their path. Ethan forced it open with a painful groan of metal. A ladder extended upward into darkness. Ethan steadied Hanley. "I'll climb first. Ranger will follow. You come after, slow and steady." Hanley nodded with resolve stiffened from years of command. Ethan began the ascent, Ranger climbing beside him with practiced ease born from search and rescue training. Behind them, Hanley gripped the rung, pulling himself upward one breath at a time. As they climbed, the hum of the facility below faded, replaced by the distant whisper of wind leaking through cracks above. They were close to the surface. Then, just as Ethan reached the hatch, the lights below flickered violently. A deep, metallic clang echoed up the shaft. Another, closer. Hanley gasped, tightening his hold. Ranger halted, head turning sharply downward. Ethan didn't turn to look. He couldn't afford to. He pushed the hatch with all his strength. Sunlight, thin but real, spilled through the opening. He climbed out, pulled Ranger up, then reached down for Hanley. The lieutenant's trembling hand grasped Ethan's wrist. Ethan hauled him through the hatch and onto the sand above. The desert air hit like a blessing. Ethan slammed the hatch shut just as a deep, resonant thud struck the steel from below. Ranger bristled, teeth baring in silent warning. Ethan reinforced the hatch with nearby rocks and sand, enough to keep it sealed until reinforcements arrived. Hanley collapsed onto the sand, exhaustion breaking through his composure. "We made it," he whispered. Ranger pressed close beside Ethan, eyes locked on the hatch, as if guarding against something he refused to let follow them. Ethan looked across the open expanse of desert, then back at the hatch. "This place stays shut," he said quietly, "until the right people open it." Hanley nodded. "And tell them what?" Ethan stared at the horizon. "Tell them the truth, and let them decide what deserves to stay buried." The chapter closes as Ranger finally relaxes beside Ethan, the desert wind sweeping away the dust of 70 forgotten years, while below the sealed hatch something shifts once more, but cannot rise. In the quiet stillness of that desert morning, as Ethan, Ranger, and the survivors took their first breath of sunlight in 70 long years, there was a feeling no science could explain, a feeling that something greater had watched over them through the darkness. Some call it fate, others call it a miracle, but perhaps it was simply the gentle hand of God, guiding those who still had purpose left in this world. We often forget, in the rush of our daily lives, that miracles do not always roar like thunder. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they appear in the quiet loyalty of a dog who refuses to leave your side, or in the courage of a stranger who chooses to descend into the unknown just to save a life he hasn't even met yet. And maybe, just maybe, each of us is held up by unseen grace more often than we realize. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope is never truly lost. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear how this story spoke to you. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel so we can walk through more stories of faith, courage, and second chances together. May God watch over you tonight. May His light reach you wherever you are. And may His blessing rest gently on you and everyone you love.